All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I feel like I need to say hello. Hopefully everyone can hear me. So we do have a couple microphones in the room, so we'll be going over logistics. I guess I should start with introductions. Always bad at that. My name is Kira Moore. I'm the director of the Air Pollution Control Program in the Department of Natural Resources, which is the lead agency for the Volkswagen Settlement Fund proceeds. So is anyone not attended a Volkswagen meeting yet? Ron, couple new faces. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our Volkswagen team and give a little bit of overview, but they didn't give me much speaking to do today, fortunately, because we had a commission meeting this morning that was very long. So the Volkswagen team is mostly sitting here to my right. Mark Leith, Shelley Reimer, oh, there's Stacy, Alan, Darcy Bybee, and also Emily Wilbur, who is not here today. Okay. Do we have anyone on the phone? Did we call the right number? Did we dial in?
No, I didn't.
Okay. Where's the agenda number? Number on the agenda. All right. There's always a few logistic items. Oh, here's an agenda right by the phone we could borrow. Can I borrow that a minute? Thank you. You want to, Darcy, you want to dial in while I... All right. Bear with us while we... So this is the Volkswagen team. Also, I would point out Julia Kadich-Mudd and Richard Waters, who are our legal counsel in the department, so they've been working on this as well. Hopefully we'll have people on the phone. I don't think we're going to go around the room and do introductions unless there's a call for that. Okay, I'm seeing shaking heads. So I would ask that we do have a couple microphones in place, and we are live streaming the meeting, and we are videotaping it. So again, you are recorded. If you do talk, we'll either pass this microphone to you, or if you can come to the podium so everyone can hear you. So I think with that, we're just going to start our presentation. The purpose of this is, I hope everyone has seen our overview slides that we gave at 4 meetings throughout the state. And we have compiled comments received at those meetings, in addition to comments received from several surveys, one online and one we sent out via a SurveyMonkey. So we're going to go over that, and then we're going to open it up for comments. But if at any time you have a question on anything we're presenting, raise your hand. We're kind of a little informal, so we would like to just address your question if you have it at the time. So with that, I'll turn it over to Kelly.
Okay, I think I can hear myself. This is loud enough? Okay. Because I have a tendency I could get pretty loud. Okay, I'm Shelley Reimer, and I'm going to start off with the first half of the presentation, and then Mark is going to take over the second part of it. So today's presentation, we're going to go over the role of the advisory committee. We'll go over it again just for any newcomers. I think a lot of you have probably seen that before. I'll give a summary on the 4 meetings that we've had in Jefferson City, Kansas City, St. Louis, and Springfield. We'll talk about the advisory committee surveys and the next survey coming up. And then Mark's going to talk about the beneficiary mitigation plan elements, the parts of that we're required to do. And then he's going to give us some more information and try to make us understand how the DERA option works. Okay, so the role of the advisory committee, that's everybody in the room here today. We expect the committee members to respond to the surveys regarding the beneficiary mitigation plan, review comments and give us input, and then participate in meetings. And then we also plan to have an early draft of the plan that will provide for your review and input before the public comment period opens. And then review comments that we receive during the public comment period. Down at the bottom, there's another link for if you haven't signed up for the advisory committee, that's on the, what is that link, the box called? Get involved, yes. The Get Involved box takes you to the advisory committee sign up. But I think we'll have the sign-in sheets from today too, so we'll get everybody included. Okay, we're going to have a summary comments, go over some questions and answers that we've been receiving from meetings, and then the meeting dates and attendance records, those are online on the web, on our webpage, the Volkswagen webpage. Let me get to the right. Okay. So from our comments, we've heard a wide variety of different comments. We've talked about the types of projects, the cost share requirements, the different types of fuels, and then we've talked quite a bit about the process for accepting applications and selecting projects. On the cost share and the fuel, we've heard, the full spectrum of different options from one end to the other. And then with all of those questions, we're getting the answers together, and then we do intend to post that on the website. Okay, so as far as some of the questions we've, heard at each of the meetings repeatedly, and so we just want to be clear about our answers with those. So the first common question that we get is if there is a conflict of interest if you're on the advisory committee, and the answer to that is no. The committee is open to the public. Committee members will help develop the overall plan, but they will not be involved in selecting the individual projects to fund. Membership does not present a conflict of interest. The next fairly frequently asked question is my organization's fleet considered government-owned? And the answer to that is yes, if it meets the definition that's in Appendix D2. And then if that definition, which is printed there, part of it anyway, if there's any uncertainty, then we'll work on answering that on a case-by-case basis. And then the third question is, can funding go towards projects not listed in Appendix D2 if they benefit air quality? We've heard that question, I don't know if we've heard it at meetings as much as we've received it on comments, the electronic comments that we've been getting. But regardless, we do hear it a lot, so the answer is no. Any project that receives funding through the Environmental Mitigation Trust must fall under one of the 10 categories listed in Appendix D2. And then no state has the option to change this. Okay, so next I'm going to go through the survey that we sent out, last week's survey. There were 12 questions, 11 questions, and the 12th was put in your comment. So I'll go through the results of that, and then we're going to talk about the next survey that we're working on now. Last week's survey, we sent it out to everybody that was on the VW email list, and we sent it out on November 28th, that was a Tuesday, and then Friday, December 1st was the deadline. And just in those few days, we actually got 151 responses to that survey, which was, nice that we had that much input. And for the most part, those 11 questions were kind of high-level decision items that we were hoping to get some input on. So this is the first breakdown here of the affiliation and who's answering. Now, this is going to be more than 100% because you could pick multiple answers on this. So say a school district would also be government, or an interest group and EV station advocate. You could have multiple answers. So you might belong to two or more of any of those given items. So that's the range of different people that we have involved in this on the advisory committee. Our high-level goals, the big one here was reduce emissions, which is good. That's kind of the whole point of this. And then we can see that the next highest thing is there in the middle in the red is the promote electric vehicles. So one thing that occurred to us this morning, actually, that I don't know that we talk about or have yet talked about a whole lot, but out of the $41 million for the electric vehicle infrastructure, it allows for 15% of the $41 million to be used for electric vehicle infrastructure and, well, hydrogen too. And so that's capped at 15%, and that comes out to about $6 million. And then how to select individual projects. If we're going to do a matrix and score the project, or do a lottery. So clearly the scoring was the winner on this one. Let me check my notes and see what we had on. I think in the other, on the other, there were some comments put in about allowing ample time for larger complex projects. That was, we had several comments saying approximately the same thing, that just be sure that we allow enough time for the difficult or, long-term projects rather than the simple ones. So, but yes, as far as scoring all, it looks like that's the way we're going to go. And then which projects should be in the plan. The blue is where we want to include those projects. And the 4 there are the large trucks, buses, medium trucks, and light-duty electric charging vehicles. And then the ones that were least popular are switch locomotives, ferries and tugboats, marine shore power, forklifts, cargo, and cargo handling. And then should we reserve a portion just for public fleets? Well, there we have a pretty close tie. So basically what we're seeing here is that the public and private fleets should compete on a level playing field. And then should we give preference to certain fuels? As I mentioned earlier, the consent decree allows for a max of 15% of the 41 million. Based on this chart, it looks like we could commit to possibly dedicating the entire 15% for the EV charging projects, because we have electric over diesel, electric over alternative fuel, and both of those are the 2 highest ones here. Should we set target areas and give preference to them? We have some, these aren't too terribly far apart, but it looks like the majority says, yes, we should have target areas. Now, we're going to have to determine what the target areas would be and what target areas are favored over others. Then we have, should we give preference to projects that provide higher matching funds? Again, we're pretty close, and the majority are saying, no, we shouldn't give preference to fleets that are willing to provide more than the minimum matching funds. However, if there was preference where projects that could put forth a higher amount of matching fund, well, then that makes the overall 41 million last longer. So this one we're going to have to probably discuss more, or maybe ask more survey questions on it. Should we require higher matching percentages than the consent decree? And again, this is the most overwhelming one that we've had as far as a clear answer that no, we shouldn't provide more. So. Okay, and then we have, since we're talking about the cost share amounts, this is a little table of the government-owned versus privately owned. So for government-owned, repower, diesel, all-electric, alternative fuel, all-electric replacement. If it's government-owned, you get 100%. If it's privately owned, you get 40, 75, 25, and 75. And then this one is just for the electric charging stations. Government-owned, again, is 100. If it's open to the public, you can get up to 80. Workplace, but not public, is up to 60. Open to multi-unit dwelling is 60. And then we have the hydrogen fuel cell stations here, which are 25 and 33%. Okay, and then now on to survey 2, which is the upcoming survey. We are, like I said, we've been working on it. We're planning to send it out about mid-December, maybe yes?
Back to survey 1,
Oh.
just one quick question.
Sure.
During the survey, where people put in their names, how many of them actually left a name or how many were left blank, do you know?
Off the top of my head, I remember one day looking at it. Oh, I'm sorry. Kevin Hurdler asked on the name, the demographics question, which was the first one, name and address stuff, how many people left that blank? Did you mean like the affiliation?
Yeah, down at your last question where it asked, could you put your name or your email in there? Was
Okay.
that left blank or was that?
A few people did not put in their names, but for the most part, everyone did. And when I say a few, I mean maybe at most a dozen. And then as far as the affiliation, I remember that I think there were 10 people that didn't check anything for affiliation. But like I said, on the affiliation one, there were, you could select multiple, so.
Yeah. My purpose for asking is stacking the deck. And I wonder if going forward, we should request that you at least give
So you're suggesting that we maybe make that mandatory
correct.
on the next surveys?
Repeat that for the
Sorry.
video and the phone. Kevin Hurdler made the comment that moving forward, in order to not stack the deck in the advisory committee, that we might require the affiliation to be a mandatory field. Is that correct? Okay.
Correct.
Any other questions? Okay.
Well, I do have one.
Sure.
And Did you say the next set of surveys or survey 2, it's only to the advisory, it says, so, but that has been established, or from this point on, more people will sign up, and so it's not just who's in the room necessarily?
Yes, we're not cutting off the sign up for the advisory committee. So it was our intention to send this next survey out to the advisory committee only, just to kind of start to narrow the field of respondents. But yes, you can still sign up for the advisory committee if you're still interested in that. If you are very compelled and want to fill out the survey but don't want to participate in the advisory committee, just send me an email and I'll make sure you see the survey. We're not trying to restrict anyone from answering the surveys. We're trying to manage, and if we send this to a smaller group, we hope that we will get responses quicker and be able to compile them quicker and kind of narrow down. But if for whatever reason you don't want to formally be on the advisory committee but you're still interested in the surveys, please let me know and I'll make sure you get them.
Okay, thank you, Kira, for jumping in there. All right, so with the upcoming survey that we're working on, perhaps 1 to 2 weeks, but really we got a really good response in just our 3 days. So maybe that is yet to be determined. And then once we have the results from the survey 2, just like we showed survey 1 here, we'll go through the second survey with you at the January meeting. Okay, so what we're thinking about on survey 2, some of this is based on the information that we got from survey 1 and what we need to know now, or if we didn't get good information, we're going to kind of break it down so that we can get some of the input that we need for writing the plan. So with funding percentages for project categories, we're going to ask about that again. We're going to have a list of the 10 project categories, and we're going to include what percentages of Missouri's 41 million should be dedicated to each category. So in your opinion, how we should break down the 41 million for the different types of projects. And then we need to talk about target areas some more, whether to develop them, what criteria we use to establish them, and how we will give preference to these projects. Then we also need to ask about fuel types again. And we plan to ask other preferential treatment based on fuel type that should also be given. And then there's the application process. And we're thinking that, like we saw on the one slide, it looks like the more popular answer was to go for scoring and use a matrix. However, we're thinking about that for the different projects, we could use different selection methods. So perhaps in January, we're going to ask some more questions on the survey, but in January or maybe February, we're thinking about breaking into groups for different project types and then working on application process for the individual different types of projects.
I would say in particular, I would encourage the electric vehicle charging stations or alternate fuel to be a separate scoring from all of the transportation, buses, and all.
Yeah.
Just because those two things are very different. If you're trying to measure the impact of emissions reduction, it's much easier to do with the replacement of a bus with an electric vehicle than it is to try and estimate a reduction from an electric vehicle charging station. So.
Right. So Eric just commented that he prefers that we keep the electric charging infrastructure group, so that would be one of the project groups, and have a separate selection process for that. Okay, and then the final thing that we, I guess it's not on the slide here, but I have in my notes here that we want to talk about the timing some more. And we mentioned this at our previous meetings, but from the trust, we can spend 1/3 of the money in the first year, 2/3 in the second year, and then after 3 years, we can use it all. However, we want to talk more about the timing if we want to, maybe select a certain amount of the money, maybe a certain percentage, to use in the first few years, and then perhaps revisit our whole process and, maybe make some changes. Because we do have the option that we can change the plan if things aren't working out, if it's not, efficient, whatever. We can make changes to the plan and adjust our methods. So, and that's all I have. Unless anybody has any more questions, I'm going to turn it over to Mark, and he's going to give you more information on the beneficiary mitigation plan and DERA. Oh, I see a question.
So I had a question about Survey 1, and I'm curious to know, kind of the vast majority of respondents, I think it was 65%, preferred not to increase cost-sharing percentages above what was recommended or the up to level. And I'm curious to see a breakdown, an analysis basically from the first survey perhaps, of where those percentages break, whether those respondents were government fleets, government entities, or if they were a good mix of private and public. Thank you.
We can put that together.
Yeah, that's one of the nice things about SurveyMonkey is it does all that stuff for us, so.
Even the free version available too.
Yes, even the free version, yes.
That is not an advertisement, it's just.
Just to you all, I'm new to this, I just heard about it on the news this morning, about it, kind of get my interest. If you all have a slide in the future that shows the 10 projects on the, I have no idea what the 10 issues are.
I'll repeat the question really quick. He wanted to see a slide of what the 10 projects are that are eligible under the Volkswagen Trust Fund. Shelley, if you go to that question where we said which category should we include in the plan, I think we might be able to pop it right up.
As Shelley was talking, and a few hands were raised that you're new to this, and so we didn't want to repeat everything we've said at the 4 meetings, but I appreciate your question because there is a lot of information on our website. We have a Volkswagen Fund website that we're required to have by the trust agreement, and that website has a lot of information on it. In addition to outlining how we got here and the settlement options, it does have the presentations we gave at the 4 introductory meetings. And in that presentation, and I have a handout, and I can hand it to you, that this is the presentation we gave at previous meetings, and it lists all the 10 options, the projects that are allowed, and it also goes into detail of how in each category the percentages that we can fund. The mentioned is government up to 100%, private up to 25 to 75%. So I apologize, we're kind of jumping in here because we didn't want to repeat ourselves too much, but I know there are several people in the room that aren't familiar with it. So I encourage you to check out their presentation on the website, and then if you have any additional questions, check out the website also. There's a lot of good information on there. Contact any of the group here, and we'd be more than happy to go through the slides with you and to give you a little VW Settlement 101. But Mark has brought up the slide. One of the survey questions asks which projects to be included. So this is the projects that the trust agreement outlined. And I would reiterate that states we do not have an option to change this. This is what the money can be spent on. It has to be spent on one of these 10 options. We've received a lot of really good ideas on how to spend this money, but we can only spend it on one of the items that is listed in the trust agreement, and that agreement was between Volkswagen and the federal government. So that is what we're charged with, is to ensure that the money spent in Missouri fits into one of those. But also, I would reiterate, and many of you have heard me say this, but the department does not want to make this decision on where this money is going. That's why we're doing these meetings. That's why we have the advisory committee. We want input from all of you on how to spend this money, and we're getting great input, and we're kind of narrowing down. I'm sure we're going to have some discussions, because as you can see, some of the slides we had 50-50. So hopefully that helps give you a high overview. Does anyone else have any general questions like that if you've missed some of the presentations? So, okay, yeah, it should be.
Hello?
It is now.
So one of my questions was, a lot of these survey questions had like an other, and then I know some of us in that other category agreed with one of the options above, but with some nuance. Was that taken into account in the?
So we didn't actually include it in the statistics we're showing today, Eric, but we are definitely taking all of those comments into account and considering all of them. And just because one of these numbers is higher, right now under Survey 1, we can still change it. We're not locked into anything today. So that's another thing that we want to make sure is clear.
Okay. Well, I guess, there were some that were like yes, no, that had to do with public and private. And I think there was an other in that category which could have swayed the balance, on that question. So I'm just wondering if someone said, yes or no, but they had an other and they tried to explain further. So I'm just wondering if you tried to put those others in a basket too, I guess.
And we can take the time to try and go through, and I think there's an option under SurveyMonkey where we can analyze it and say, well, this one really is agreeing with yes, or this one's agreeing with no. We haven't taken that step in this data you're looking at today. We just said, is it undecided? Then you're undecided. And the other category, we didn't. We included it for a few of them, like I want to say, okay. So like for slide 15, high-level goals, there were a few others that people had. And then like Shelley had mentioned, there were some others under how should we actually score the projects in order to select them. I don't believe there was an other under public fleets, but there was an undecided, and that, that's 12% that could sway it. So, and like we say, we're not locking anything in today, so don't get nervous if the statistics aren't showing just what you want. We're still collecting input. We're still soliciting feedback. We're just showing you what we've seen so far through the surveys. Is there any additional questions about Survey 1, the role of the advisory committee, the upcoming survey number 2?
I don't think I need a microphone. I'm used to speaking over loud edges.
Well, we're videotaping you, so yes, you do.
Thank you. Paul Brugman with comments. One question I had about the survey process so far and going forward is, do you think the general public understands the DERA option really well enough to make a good call on that option? When you look at it, as it's explained, a lot of people don't know what's really involved in the things covered under the DERA umbrella. Plus, I don't know if a lot of people really understand that the states get a bonus in if we use that option, correct? So I just want to, there's sort of a suggestion in that as well, I guess, but my question is, do people really understand what DERA is well enough in a survey to really respond to that in a valid way? Thank you.
Paul, that's a really good question. We actually have about 4 or 5 slides today that are aimed at trying to educate folks so that more people will understand what the DERA option is. So we are going to go over that. We think that there is value there for people to at least understand what this program is and what that option, how it relates to the Volkswagen settlement. So we're going to take the time today to try and educate everybody in the room and those folks listening online what that DERA option is. So very good comment.
I would mention that we do have a live mic now down at the other end of the room. So if you have a question down there, you can just go to the corner. Our wonderful assistants on the communications have set that up very quickly. I appreciate that.
I'm going to go ahead, in the interest of time, and move forward with the last two categories of topics, the beneficiary mitigation plan elements and the DERA option. Darcy's went over both of these categories briefly in the introductory meetings, but we're going to kind of try and just make sure that everybody understands what are the elements that we're required to include in our mitigation plan and how they relate to the survey questions that we've been asking. And then again, as Paul had commented, we're going to try and have a few slides to explain what that DERA option is and how it would work and relate to the Volkswagen Trust. So there's four categories, four elements that every state has to include in their mitigation plan. There's other considerations that could also be included, but these four things have to be addressed in every state's plan when they submit it to the trustee. Number one is the overall goal. So what is the state's overall goal to get out of this $41 million? And our question number one in survey one was, what should the state's overall goal be? So that's why we're asking these questions. We have to put it in our plan. The next element that has to be in every state's plan is, out of those 10 eligible categories, which of those categories of projects should we put in our plan in order to meet those overall goals that we've stated? And then how much of the 41 million should be dedicated to the various categories that we select to choose? So I think, as Shelley had mentioned in survey 2, we're gonna put the list of the 10 project categories out there for everybody and ask you, what percentage of funding do you think should go to each of those categories? We have a question.
Yes, is there an option to not fund?
Oh, I turned it off. Okay. Is there an option to not fund one of those categories, or do all the categories have to have a minimum amount of funding?
No, every state has the option to select which ones that they want to include, and if there's any they feel would not contribute to the overall goal, they could prevent fleets from applying for those particular project categories.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so once we have which categories out of the 10 we want to include in the plan and how much should be dedicated to each, the next is every state has to explain how they considered the air quality benefits for areas that have a disproportionate share of the air pollution burden within the state. So how that's going to be done, we have a few slides that give some ideas of how we can explain that we considered this, and we're going to go over that. And then finally, out of the categories that we select to choose in the plan, we have to estimate the amount of emission reductions that we expect those categories to achieve based on the amount of money that we're putting towards each category. So these four elements, they have to go in the plan. This is the bare minimum of what the plan has to include. So just to break it down, we've talked about some of the overall goals. You saw it on the survey question. We're just listing examples. There's other goals that could be included as well, but I mean, reduce emissions. Shelley had mentioned in survey 1, that was the number one picked. That is, the goal is to mitigate the excess NOx emissions that were caused by the affected Volkswagen vehicles. You can focus on these areas that might be struggling to meet outdoor air quality standards. You might want to spread the funds throughout the state so you get more benefactors, promote new or alternative fuels and technology. And again, there's other examples of things we could have as an overall goal. So then, project categories and percentages. Like we've been saying, we have to know which of these 10 project categories we're going to allow people to come to us and apply for a project. And they should tie into the overall goals that we state in our plan that we're trying to achieve, which I'm going to go over some potential inconsistencies that we saw in Survey 1, how some of the selections may not match with some of the overall goals that the most people selected. And then again, how much funding should go to each one of those categories. The plan has to include this. Now, I said I'd kind of mention, we have to consider the air quality benefits for areas with disproportionate share of the air pollution burden within the state. That's the language of the consent decree. We have to explain how the state considered this when we were writing our plan. So in my opinion, there's two things we have to do. First, we have to identify where are these areas, and so that's what this slide's kind of based on. What information and criteria should we consider to develop these areas that bear a disproportionate share of the air pollution burden? We could look at things like, non-attainment and maintenance area for national ambient air quality standards, the location of affected Volkswagen vehicles, where they were registered at. We could get a little bit smaller and look at hotspot areas like ports, industry parks, rail yards, that type of thing. We could look at sensitive populations. Are there areas where there's high emissions around, say, hospitals or schools or nursing homes? And there's other ways that we can identify these areas that are bearing a disproportionate share, but those are just some examples. And then once we identify where these areas are, now we have to explain how we're considering the air quality benefits that are going to be achieved through the trust fund for these areas. One way we could do it is to give preference in the selection process for projects that come out of those areas. Some ways we could give preference to these projects. We could have a carve out, of the 41 million that's dedicated specifically for an area of the state, and only projects that are located in that area of the state are going to be eligible to apply for that carve out of the 41 million. We could require lower cost share amounts for projects in those areas. Now, I'm going to take a little bit of time on this. Under the Survey 1, everybody said we should not require a lower cost share or higher cost share than what's allowed for in the consent decree. So if we're already at the minimum, then we're not going to be able to go any lower than the minimum. But if in some areas we required higher cost share amounts than what's in the decree, maybe we don't do 100% for all government-owned fleets, maybe we do 50, 70, 80, then in like the target areas, we could maybe give, 90 or 100%. That would be one way to add preference and catalyze projects to come out of those areas. Another option would be just if we're going to be scoring these applications, which was by, pretty overwhelming majority of folks said we should score and grade them and pick the best projects, we could give bonus points on applications if the projects are located in these target areas. So these are all different ideas. There's other options for ways that we can give preference to ensure that we're selecting the projects in these areas that bear the disproportionate share. So just food for thought. The new survey is going to ask questions about this, so we want to make sure everybody understands what we're asking them. And we're going to have these different options for how we give that preference and ask you which of these ways should the state be giving preference to these areas. So we want to make sure everybody understands it. And then estimating emission benefits. Once we have the project categories and how much money we're going to be putting towards each one of them, the Air Pollution Control Program under Missouri DNR, we do this day to day. We are able to estimate the emission reductions for these types of projects. We have several tools available to us and experienced staff. So once we have the funding and the funding numbers and for all the various categories, we should be able to come up with those estimates without too much trouble. So now, like I had mentioned, I want to talk a little bit about the emission reductions of various projects. We pulled some data off the NASEO, National Association of State Energy Offices, has developed a toolkit that states can use as they're developing their beneficiary mitigation plans. And it includes a range of this is the range of emission reductions you'll expect for a typical project of type A, type B. And so I've kind of displayed it in chart format here for everybody to look at. First thing I'm going to look at is, the age of the fleet that's either being upgraded or replaced and how that affects the emission reductions that you're going to achieve. As you might expect, emission standards have gotten tighter and tighter as the years have progressed, and so if we can replace the oldest trucks, we're going to get the most amount of emission reductions on an annual basis. However, we need to balance that with the fact that the older trucks may be ready to retire in 2 or 3 years, and so they may be coming off the streets anyway. Maybe if you do something more in the middle, that truck may have lasted for an additional 10, 15 years, and so the reductions can balance out. So it's not just a guarantee, let's go after the oldest. There needs to be some thought put into this. And then next, I want to look at the type of fleet. So when I'm saying type of fleet, I'm saying, is it a bus? Is it a truck? Is it a train? Is it a boat? Is it something that you're going to find at a yard, like a container handler, a crane, yard truck? And I think it's pretty obviously when you look at this picture that 3 of them kind of jump out, that you get the most emission reductions when you replace these kinds of diesel fleets. And that's these 3 here in the middle, the freight switcher, tugboats, and ferries. So if our goal is to reduce the most emissions possible, these three, I think, should be given heavy consideration. The emission reductions you get from these kinds of projects, they dwarf the emission reductions from the other types of projects. Another thing about these particular three is we don't have folks just knocking down our door with these projects ready to go. So they're kind of difficult to find. Anybody that does have experience with the DERA program knows, hey, if I can find a tugboat fleet willing to repower an engine, I got a pretty good chance of getting a DERA grant, because they really do achieve a lot of emission reductions when you're replacing those old engines. But I'm going to show kind of how this conflicts with some of the answers we got in Survey 1, but maybe just because folks don't understand. If we look at Survey 1, what should the high-level goals be in Missouri? The highest and most commonly selected choice was reduce emissions. And so when you look, then we also asked which categories should be included in the plan. And when you look at ferries and tugs and switch locomotives, more people say we should not include those projects in the plan than should be included. And so there's a little bit of an inconsistency going on there that we probably want to make sure that everyone understands. It doesn't mean that we definitely should include locomotives and tugs. It doesn't mean that reducing emissions still shouldn't be a goal, but just make sure that when we pick the categories that go in the plan, we have to tie it back to the goals that we put. So just so everybody understands, we wanted to kind of show that. And then another thing on kind of from the NASIO toolkit site, this was based on if you're going to replace a large truck like a trash truck or semi-truck with a brand new truck using different kinds of fuels, either a new truck that's run on diesel, compressed natural gas, a hybrid truck, or an all-electric truck, how many emission reductions would you get per year? And as you can see, the numbers are pretty balanced. You get about the same amount no matter what the new fuel is. That's because today's standards really are near zero. And the way that we calculate the emission reductions, most regulators, it's going to be based on what level the engines are certified and required to meet for that given model year. So with that information in mind, then we look again back at the survey, keeping in mind that emission reductions was the most commonly selected goal, and we see everybody. Oh, sorry. Let me go back here. We see that electric was preferred more than any other different fuel. However, as we know, electric vehicles, at least the upfront cost, will be able to fund fewer of those because they are more expensive. And so in terms of short-term emission reductions, we may not be getting as many by going after the electric vehicle for the new fuel type. However, there's other reasons why we may want to go after electric vehicles. There's the long term. We can drive the cost down. It could be the end goal, and we'll get there faster. So I'm not trying to advocate for anything here. I just want to make sure everybody kind of understands that this is where the numbers are. Here's what we're hearing, and make sure that we have to tie the project categories back to the goals that we pick. So maybe we want to pick some different goals or balance the goals out a little bit more, but that was the point that I wanted to make there.
Could you back up one slide?
Sure. This one or one more?
One more. Okay, thank you.
And then, as I mentioned, those are the four elements that have to go in every state's mitigation plan. But there's other things that could make the plan a little bit easier to implement, possibly more transparent, and that has to do with what is the process that we're going to use to actually pick the projects that are going to receive funding. The less gap filling that the department has to do, the more transparent this process is going to be, and the more straightforward it's going to be. It's also going to be easier on us because we'll have to do less gap filling. So if we can kind of nail that down and explain, here's how we're going to score the projects, then all we have to do is develop the application, take the projects, and score them like the way that our plan says. It'll make it a little bit easier. But that doesn't have to necessarily go in the mitigation plan, but it could make it a little bit easier and streamlined and transparent going forward. Again, preferred fuel types, not a requirement, but we've heard at every meeting someone has an opinion on what the right fuel is for the future vehicles that are purchased through the program. So because we've gotten so much interest and it's the full spectrum, we want to keep trying to iron that out. So as I promised, now I'm going to move on. Darcy also covered the DERA option in her presentation in the kickoff meetings, but we want to take a little bit more time today just to make sure that everybody really fully understands what this program is, how the matching bonus works. I'm even going to go over an example for the matching bonus. The fact that DERA actually allows different projects that aren't listed in the other 9 in the consent decree. And then to be fair, I'm going to also mention the potential drawbacks or at least some considerations that the group should be aware of before we decide to throw money into the DERA program. So an overview of the DERA program, it stands for the Diesel Emissions Reduction Act, and it's basically a federal grant program that Congress appropriates money to each year, and then it's divided among the states. 60% of that money is competitive, and pretty much any nonprofit or government organization can apply for it. And then EPA grades and scores those projects and picks the best ones to do it. That's the 60% piece of the pie. But what I want to talk about for the Volkswagen Trust is this 30%. That money is guaranteed to each state, and it gets divided evenly among all the states. And as long as the state does a program that's eligible under DERA, we're able to get the money, and we're not graded against the other states. We don't have to compete. It's guaranteed for every state to get an equal share. And that is where, if we want, we can throw voluntarily, we can elect to choose to put Volkswagen money into our state program in order to do more projects under DERA. And that's the way that option 10, the DERA option, works in the Volkswagen Trust. So why would we want to do that? First of all, I'll explain that Volkswagen, the projects under DERA, categories 1 through 8 under Volkswagen, medium trucks, buses, tugboats, trains, they're all eligible to do under DERA as well. So if we're going to be doing these projects anyway, and we put the money, we slide it over and say we're doing it under the DERA program, then we qualify for what's called a matching bonus. And so let's assume ordinarily, the federal DERA grant that the state gets each year is going to be around $150,000 to $250,000. So let's say it's $200,000 is the grant that we're guaranteed as a state to get. If we were to take $200,000 from the VW Trust and do additional projects, then we qualify for a bonus that's worth 50% of the initial grant. So if it was a $200,000 grant, we would get an extra bonus bag of $100,000 to do even more projects. If we elect not to do this, then that bonus money just gets divided among the other 49 states. So we really lose out on it if we decide that we don't want to do it. And if it's projects that are going to be eligible under DERA anyway, it seems like it would make sense to at least get that bonus money at a minimum. We don't have to throw all 41 million or anything remotely close to that. Like I said, it's usually about $150,000, $250,000 a year is that grant that we would have to match to qualify for the bonus. So I'm going to explain now an example of how this would work. I didn't realize I had all these animations on this, so bear with me. All right, I think this is the full slide. So let's say our original grant was $100,000. And for the grant, the last 3 years under DERA, we've done school bus replacement. So I'm going to use that as the example. If we were to give $25,000 to 4 different school districts to replace a school bus, that would be our DERA grant. Now, if we decided we want to do the same thing with $100,000 from the Volkswagen Trust and do 4 more school bus replacements, give $25,000 to 4 other school districts, now we've replaced a total of 8 buses. Then, because we use the VW funds to do that and we put it under DERA, we're going to get another $50,000 from the federal government for our DERA program. We could do 2 more bus replacements that we wouldn't have otherwise been able to do. So that is kind of how the bonus works, and I just want to make sure everybody kind of understands that we're leaving money on the table if we don't get it, and we haven't qualified for the bonus in the last 3 to 4 years. So this is an avenue where we could potentially qualify for it, is to use the Volkswagen. So now, as I mentioned, I'll explain also that DERA has additional project options other than the categories 1 through 9 that are in the Volkswagen Trust. So it's possible that folks have great projects out there to do. They don't fall under categories 1 through 9, but they are eligible under DERA. Well, one idea is, well, we could put a little pot of money over into DERA that's just for these kinds of projects. That way, folks that have a project eligible under DERA that's not eligible under one of the other categories would have an avenue to go after that funding, and we could design a program like that. Just an idea. I'm not advocating for anything. But we've heard interest for certain projects that we say, well, it's not eligible under one of those categories, but it would be eligible under DERA. So just want to make sure that people understand that there are extra different projects other than those 1 through 9 that could be implemented under DERA if we designed our program that way. And then, as I mentioned, there's certainly some considerations about the DERA program that, to be fair, we want to make sure everyone understands. The cost share requirements aren't going to be the same as what's in the consent decree and the Volkswagen Trust. They're defined each year by EPA. What is the cost share requirement? The one thing that's really different is there's no 100% funding for the government-owned fleets. The cost share for any kind of repower or replacement under DERA is going to be very similar to what the privately owned cost share requirements are under Volkswagen. They do change a little bit year to year, but they're very similar to those privately owned, the 25% for a diesel replacement, 40% for a repower. And then because the requirements change from year to year, it can make planning a little bit more difficult. So that's a potential drawback that we would want to keep in mind. The timing requirements as well. Under Volkswagen, we have 10 years to do our program. Under DERA, they're 1-year programs. And it's possible, and every 2 or 3 years, EPA kind of hits the stop button and says, all right, states, if you're not done finished and spending all your money this year, you're not going to qualify and you're not going to get next year's award. So we really do kind of have to stick to that 1 year. We can ask for an extension, but it could cost us a grant the following year. So that's a consideration for sure. We don't want to throw $3 million into a DERA program and then be like, oh, it's going to take us two or 3 years in order to finish this project, because then we wouldn't qualify for next year's award, potentially. All right. We always go over our timeline. This is the same timeline we've been sharing at the introductory meetings just to give folks an idea of when is this money really going to be available. So we did file our certification with the court and the trustee back in November. The deadline was December 1st, so we met that. It's been confirmed that they have both received it. In January, the trustees were required to put out a list of all the states that did that successfully. Like right now, we're holding these outreach and advisory meetings to gather your all's input to inform the development of our mitigation plan. Our hope is that maybe by March, maybe April, we could actually release a proposed plan and start accepting public comments on that plan. That would maybe line us up to submit the actual final plan in May, and then as early as the summer of next year, we could actually start accepting applications for projects and then awarding the funds to those various projects. So I think that now we are ready for questions. So I'd love to see if we got any discussion or kick it back to Kira who. Oh yeah, for the folks on the live stream, we've got a link to the call-in number because I think sometimes it might seem like an echo to those folks. They just hang up the phone and just listen because you can listen through your speakers. So if folks that are live streaming want to call in, we've got the number up on the screen now. And with that, I'm going to open it up.
Yeah, if there's any questions. I do know we have a couple people that want to provide some comments, but if you have questions for staff on what we just presented, let's do that first, and then we'll open it up for public comment. And I think we have 1 or 2 presentations and a couple. I see a hand down there.
Yeah, that's me again. I just wanted to comment on the emissions slide where you show equivalent emissions for the new diesel engines versus the alternative fuel options. And that is true for on-road vehicles, but there have been studies recently that show that the new diesel engines don't idle very well, and that those low-speed where did I put my note? Low-speed, high idle jobs done by heavy-duty diesel engines do not perform as well as they're modeled in the emissions testing. And so that is something that there are reports out there that were done by Argonne National Lab that we can provide. I wasn't able to find them before this meeting, but I can certainly provide them by email. And thank you.
Appreciate the comment. Like I say, this slide, we pulled this information from the National Association State Energy Office's State Beneficiary Mitigation Plan Toolkit that they released. States could use as they're developing their plan. It's just information. Like I say, this is a 95 large truck. I think for idling, you're probably right. The certification likely is going to be looking at different duty cycles than idling. So that's not probably going to be part of the certification for most vehicles.
Go back to the timeline.
Sure. Was asked to go back to the timeline. Let's do it a little bit easier.
It was right before your question slide at the very end. There you go. Thank you.
And I want to mention, we are planning to post this presentation online, probably, hopefully today, maybe tomorrow. So it'll be available for anybody to download. Yes.
I'm just, thanks. I'm just curious about how you determine the emissions generated to fuel an electric vehicle. I mean, you've got to, in Missouri, you've got to burn coal to generate electricity, so the emissions reduction isn't zero with an EV. How do you, as an agency, determine what the real emissions are from that?
That's a pretty good question. I want to say that the way that NASIO did it in this toolkit was they just assume that the emissions are zero from an electric vehicle because there's nothing coming out of the tailpipe. However, I think the consideration that you make is a good one, and we should consider that as well, the full life cycle emissions.
Do we have any questions? Anyone on the phone? Okay. Well, I do know we have at least one presentation for comments, and unless you have questions for staff, we can go to that. And then I know we have another couple people who want to provide some comment. Oh, I see a hand down there.
So I looked at the DNR website, and I could find the non-attainment areas, but where do you find the secondary areas, and what are they called again? Ozone maintenance areas. So how do we identify those for us non-air?
If you all didn't hear the question, there was in one of our slides we talk about non-attainment and maintenance areas. Maintenance areas are areas that were non-attainment for a national ambient air quality standard, but is currently maintaining the standard. I don't think we have a map online of any maintenance areas because we don't have
none.
We don't have any maintenance areas right now. So we just have non-attainment, and if that map is online. It's predominantly the St. Louis area, and then there's a couple areas around the state.
I think at the last meeting you said something about pre-non-attainment areas. No? Did I just?
I don't remember a discussion on pre-non-attainment areas. We do know areas that are close to the standards, and we don't currently have any, especially for NOx, that we would be. Right. Okay. So Julia reminded me there are. So St. Louis, the St. Louis area, the city of St. Louis, and the counties of St. Louis, St. Charles, Jefferson, and Franklin are currently designated non-attainment for the ozone standard, and it's for the 2008 ozone standard. We just heard at the commission meeting this morning the department's recommendation on the 2015 ozone standard, and we are recommending to EPA that the non-attainment area for that would be the city of St. Louis and the counties of St. Louis and St. Charles. So that would be upcoming. So actually the non-attainment area in St. Louis, once we're redesignated for 2008, which is hopefully in the next couple months, that area would become a maintenance area, and then the non-attainment area would shrink if what the department is proposing goes through the process. So that might be what you remember hearing. So there are several ozone standards, and one of them we are still working with EPA on the designation of that area. Anything else? Okay.
So Dan was asking about Kansas City. Under the 97 ozone standard, Kansas City was a maintenance area. However, that standard was now revoked, and so I want to say maybe the 1 hour standard is when they were a maintenance area. So maybe the 79 standard, and they came into attainment, but the standard was revoked, and so they're no longer considered a maintenance area.
Going back to her question.
Sure.
That may be one of the things that St. Louis for sure, Kansas City were close. We've been close in the past, and as the standard is lower.
One thing that I would point out is when we're talking about ozone, and obviously nitrogen dioxides play into that, and we're reducing those emissions through this trust, is the state of Missouri has 23 ozone monitors throughout the state. The ozone season runs March 1st to October 31st, and we publish that data on a weekly basis. Currently, there's only one monitor in the state of Missouri violating the 2015 ozone standard, and that is the West Alton monitor in the St. Louis area. But you can look at the ozone data and see where all the rest of those 22 monitors are at. Some are upper 50s, some are 60, some are 65, and so you could focus on those areas that are hovering, if you will, near the standard of 70 parts per billion. Okay, any other questions? Okay.
So I throw this out just for general discussion, it's going to run counter to the survey responses, but I feel very strongly that these funds came from a settlement that was won basically by the people and for the people. And so I do really feel like governments and nonprofits should have preference over private. And I think that complements the structure of the consent decree already, because the consent decree does favor government-owned entities already. So just feel that very strongly. So.
Thanks, Eric. I think we'll turn to the one PowerPoint I know we have, so we can then maybe turn the lights on. Everyone can see each other. So.
Mark, did you say you had a clicker?
I do. Let me turn it on for you.
And so it's just right for force, I guess. Thanks. Good afternoon. My name is Pat Justice, and I work for Ameren, Missouri, out of our St. Louis office. But today I am here representing the groups that you see on this first slide, which are 10 entities that cover energy companies as well as other organizations. So you have your investor-owned utilities here, all three of those, three of the larger municipals and the association, the MPUA, and Kansas City Clean Cities, and NRDC and Sierra Club. So first I'd like to ask, since I'm presenting on behalf of this group, who from these groups is in the room? Raise your hand, please. Okay, great. We've been working, I'd say, off and on over the past year on providing comments to the AIR program. And we are advocates of efficient electrification, including transportation electrification and electric vehicle charging. And together, today we're presenting one aspect of the comments that we've provided, which is development of Missouri statewide highway corridor fast charging, which is really missing in our state. So I'm going to do a really quick run through an overview. Doesn't give it nearly enough time to really talk about it in depth, but over 10 minutes you can get a good sense of what we're talking about. So there's three primary reasons that Missouri should be supporting and encouraging electric vehicle adoption. And the first of those is environmental. So electric vehicles are extremely efficient. And absolutely agree with the gentleman that we should be drawing a circle around the generation facilities as well, not just the tailpipe of the car, which of course doesn't exist on a full electric. When you consider that, you still have almost 50% less NOx, even with fossil-based utilities that we have in Missouri. Now, the electric grid that's fueling these cars also is getting greener all the time. You hear about introduction of new renewables, so it's becoming a bigger piece of the pie. And then an extra bonus is the zero emissions at ground level that really sometimes is overlooked. For pedestrians, bicyclists, even ironically drivers in traffic, this is a big bonus. And for communities right adjacent to roadways, they're not exposed to the direct emissions as much. Secondly, the first cost economics are very promising for electric vehicle technology and the batteries that propel them. But in the meantime, there are still some great economic numbers here. There's less maintenance because these vehicles are simpler, many less moving parts. Refueling costs half of that of petroleum when you're charging at home, and that's at today's $2.25 a gallon rate approximately. Reduce petroleum dependence, which most folks would say is a good thing. And for utilities and utility customers, a very important one is off-peak charging and grid benefits. Electric vehicles represent a very flexible load. They will primarily charge at night when it's the easiest for power companies to produce that power, and therefore that nighttime charging helps cause downward pressure overall on electric rates. So that's a real biggie for utilities and for our customers. And then finally, and probably the most important reason to consumers in the future, is that these vehicles are just a better driving experience. So folks that drive electric vehicles generally love them and pretty quickly realize that it's just a better way to move a car. So as I said, battery technology and EVs, they're evolving very rapidly. Many believe that the breakthrough EV that will cause more widespread adoption is the EV that has a 300 or higher range for less than $30,000. And so developing rapidly, you see the car on the screen is a Chevy Bolt EV. This is all electric. It came to Missouri in September of this year. This car has a 238-mile range for $37,500. So the EVs are coming a long way pretty quickly. So let's imagine that you do get to this 300-plus mile range for less than 30 in the next few years. What could happen? Well, you're going to go to the showroom and think this is a great car. You're going to drive it, you're going to love it, and you're going to have a conversation about taking it long distance. And it's a non-starter if there is not long-distance charging. If you can't get the 250-mile trip from Kirksville to Springfield and back without having to plot exactly where you're going to be successful in charging and not have more than one option, it's not going to work out. And so we've got to have DC fast charging on our corridors to really open up the electric vehicle market and get EVs adopted in a widespread manner. So I think this picture tells a lot. This is the DC fast charging that's available to the public in Missouri right now. You can see it's clustered in Kansas City and St. Louis, and nowhere, literally nowhere in between. So this is a bit of a chicken and egg. You've got, you've got a lack of vehicles for the private sector to come in and set up quick charging, and you don't have quick chargers that give the public confidence as they will see these longer distance vehicles come in. So what are we proposing? We're proposing to solve this problem with a minimum practical network of DC fast charging. It would be statewide. Each charging island would have a minimum of 2 DC fast chargers and 2 level 2 ports. These charging islands would be suitable for charging any vehicle on the road today or tomorrow. They would have credit card capability at a minimum and probably more payment options, spaced about 25 to 75 miles apart. They'd be in communities of populations of about 2,000 or greater, of course near interstates and multi-lane highways. We'd look to acquire no-cost easements to keep the cost of the project down. And they have to be within walking distance of amenities, because charging, while it is increasing in speed pretty quickly, it is still longer than a gasoline experience. And of course, they would have to have high reliability and availability. If you've got a minimum practical network, it has to be up. And of course, as utilities, that's something that we specialize in, so that's something that would happen with these. Now, we have identified locations and general locations for fast charging islands, not specific sites. And we use GIS population data as well as MoDOT traffic count maps to help determine where they should be. We designated them as priority 1, 2, or 3 based on the importance of establishing them, and the level of traffic that's on them was a major factor on that. Now, ideally, we would establish the whole network right away, but if that's not possible, we do have the priorities listed. So the process resulted in 24 sites on interstates, 10 sites on multi-lane higher traffic areas, and 6 in multi-lane light. From information we've gotten from the market and our own experience, we expect the cost of each island to range from $170,000 up to $360,000, and that depends on several factors. So the total development cost of the network is in the range of $6.8 million to $14.4 million. Now, this is a network that would provide that minimum practical network. It would essentially erase the long-distance barrier. So the factors that matter are the charging rate of the equipment, which you can see in those two lines, a 50 kilowatt versus 150 kilowatt fast charger, but also line extension size and complexity, the distance you have to run the line extension, the location of the site, and the site development complexity. And here's the map that we've developed with the 40 charging islands. You can see color coding for the various utilities, whether it's the IOUs or co-ops and municipalities have been grouped. May be hard to see here. I've brought a paper copy I can hang after discussion is done. I imagine, this work has taken quite a bit of time, put a lot of effort into this, but this is still really just a vision of what could be. If we're encouraged to do more on this and do more planning, it's going to take quite a bit of detailed work. And when we do that, I expect some of these locations would probably move slightly. So next steps as we see it would be, we would need to formalize expectations, establish an approved oversight plan, identify specific locations, designate the utilities that would be responsible to develop each site, determine funding distribution and cost sharing from the VW dollars, collaborate on the sourcing materials and services to make sure we develop it as efficiently and cost effectively as possible. And then finally develop the final plan and timeline for approval. And so we think it's probably 6 to 9 months to do more detailed planning work, and then another 12 to 18 months to actually build this out. Okay. And that's it for this presentation. Do you want to take questions on this or go to other comments?
I had a couple, I had a question for you, Pat, if that's
Sure,
okay.
of
So
course.
does the those costs that you put, the $6 to $14 million for this network, does that include land acquisition? And are we just, the plan's not that far along yet?
Right. We're assuming there's no land acquisition, that we would be able to find locations that would like to have this as an amenity.
Okay.
So host locations that wouldn't have responsibility for maintaining it, though.
Gotcha. So are you thinking private stations or like government-owned?
Right. Well,
Or a mix?
the plan goes into a little bit of detail that we've submitted, and there's a narrative plan that goes with this presentation, but it would probably be a mix depending on the utility. For example, right now in Missouri, based on the case that we had last year, investor-owned would not be able to own and operate these. But it may be that a municipal or a cooperative could. So in the investor-owned case, we would, at this point, probably be looking to having private ownership, but in a contractual manner that holds them accountable. Because, you know, if this is being used by the VW settlement dollars and public dollars, we want to make sure that these things are operational.
Sure.
And I think of it kind of like maybe, I don't know if this is exactly right, but maybe like a park where concessionaires come in and can operate for a profit. That's probably not exactly right, but something like that. What we do know is that from talking to the marketplace, you know, they're not here for a reason, like I described the chicken and egg. So they're going to need a lot of subsidy to come in and set up shop and operate it privately.
That's all I had. Thanks, Pat.
I'm just curious how the PSC decision on rollout of utilities building EV charging meshes with that plan.
Right. So as I was just trying to describe, we would not be able to own and operate the equipment at this point.
But this,
And-
would it require a change in current regulations, or
For us to own and operate it,
this is an existing way to get there?
okay, you may have a different operational model with each type of utility because of the regulations being different for investor-owns versus the others. For the investor-owns you specifically are asking about,
I guess so, yeah.
we would seek to establish an understanding that if we're not operating these and setting the prices, there's a private entity that's doing that. And there would be a competitive process in that. But we would certainly have to seek approval.
I just feel like that's going to require a change in regs or something, right?
Not necessarily a change in regulation, but it could require approval. It would require approval from our commission.
I think that's the only other PowerPoint we have, so we'll turn the lights on and I know there are others commenting. And if you'll go to one of the microphones, that would be the easiest, so.
Thank you, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Ron Leone, and I'm the Executive Director for the Missouri Petroleum Marketers and Convenience Store Association. So I represent gas stations, convenience stores, their suppliers, truck stops, things like that across the state. I provided a document here. It's a two-page, or actually a two-sided document for most of you. Got a little green thing at the top. And I just wanted to kind of give maybe a little bit of a different perspective on this. I'm going to talk mostly about the second page of my document. I'm going to read a portion of it. Normally I don't like to read things. I like to talk off the top of my head, but I think it's important to get some of these thoughts out, and then maybe I can extrapolate a little bit on them and answer some questions. My association, we call us MPCA, and we oppose public dollars being used to directly compete with private sector industries and private sector businesses. The settlement that we're talking about here, in our opinion, is public money that should not be used to fund whatever is part of the next generation of motor vehicles and motor fuels, and that is including but not limited to natural gas, electric, hydrogen, propane, because it directly competes with the more traditional and mature existing motor vehicles and motor fuel retailers that I represent, such as the gas stations, convenience stores that sell gasoline, diesel, and ethanol blends. My members, literally for generations, have spent hundreds of millions of their own dollars to ensure that Missourians have ready access to a wide variety of reasonably priced motor fuels and convenience items. This private sector investment has generated tens of thousands of jobs and hundreds of millions of local and state tax dollars, whether you're talking sales taxes, motor fuel taxes, tobacco taxes, property taxes, business taxes, and the fees and the income taxes. We pay a lot of taxes and have been doing that for generations. For the state of Missouri to use what we believe is public dollars to fund our direct private or public sector competitors is bad public policy. It's fundamentally unfair. It's unwise, and we believe ultimately it's counterproductive because my members, these small businesses, will thereafter generate less of the critical local and state tax revenues that we all rely on in this room, not only for the services that we have in our local communities, but some of us actually rely on it for our actual salaries. The next generation of motor vehicles and motor fuels should be left up to the private sector and the free market, including supply and demand. The state of Missouri should not be involved in choosing and funding private sector winners and losers. Now, I'm kind of new to this process, and I learned a lot today, so I very much appreciate coming to this meeting and seeing the different parameters that you have with respect to the settlement, what you can do with the money, what you can't do with the money. My goal here today is to make sure everybody is very mindful that you are literally picking winners and losers in the free market. There will be people that are happy with your decisions. There are people like maybe Ameren if you decide to put in infrastructure down the interstates. There are people like me and my members that are going to be unhappy with your decision, and I ask that you tread very lightly in whatever you decide to do with this money and think more of the public good versus a particular industry good, private sector, or public sector. So I kind of want to just throw that out there so people start thinking about it. I get there's $41 million out there. I understand what that's like when it seems like there's money to be spent and it could benefit our investors or our constituents or our members. But it's really important that you're careful that you're not picking winners and losers while still staying within the parameters of the settlement or decree, whatever you call it. I didn't get into a lot of detail on that, but I read some of the stuff on the DNR's website about this particular issue. So I wanted to kind of throw it out there. If this money is spent for hydrogen, if it's spent for electric, if it's spent for propane, there's going to be winners and losers on that thing. And I get it, but some people aren't going to be real happy about it. Some people are going to be real happy about it. And I'm only asking that you step back a little bit, look a little bit more at 10,000 feet, and try and tread as lightly as possible so you have the least impact on the private sector, because ultimately it could be very counterproductive. I think I've said it 4 different ways. I'm sure everybody understands what I'm trying to get at. Anybody have any questions, comments? Think I'm full of crap? Think I'm great? Yeah, I know what you're going to say, Steve.
Okay. I would like to follow up on some of your comments and just say that, and I'm an alternative fuel advocate. I do also have diesel stakeholders because biodiesel is a drop-in fuel that is available at convenience stores, obviously. The one thing in your statement that I would comment on is that alternative fuels such as natural gas and propane and electric aren't available and can't be made available by your members. Because I do work with convenience store owners and fuel retailers in the state of Kansas and Missouri that are installing alternative fuels, compressed natural gas and propane, and even electric charging stations on their properties. And so I think that there is an opportunity to work with the convenience store owners and marketers and have a kind of a melding of the minds instead of
Sure.
an adversarial relationship.
Yeah, I don't necessarily disagree with that, but see, I'm not coming here asking for you to put in our infrastructure. And there's a lot of people in this room saying, give us money, public money to benefit our particular industry. I'm not asking for that. I'm actually asking the opposite of that. My members are doing exactly what you're describing right now and investing their own money and risking their own money on that. I'm not here advocating for our piece of this $41 million. I'm saying you do it in a way that doesn't hurt the people you rely on, which are my members, and who are currently investing their hard-earned money in alternative fuels, because nobody really knows what is the next iteration of fuel. There's a lot of different fuels out there at this point in time. Eventually, one's going to rise to the top. In the meantime, we're all stumbling along. And again, I think it's important that you let the private sector determine what is next, and you don't use my members' own money against them.
Just real quick here, Ron.
Yes,
First
sir.
of all, I don't think you're full of crap. Those were your words, and I definitely appreciate this is a kind of a unique point of view, right? So thank you for coming out. I mean, the way you phrased it, though, is using public dollars to pick winners and losers. I mean, really what this is, though, I mean, this is the public saying, this is what we want. So, I mean, that's what the survey really is. I mean, there's obviously some private interest in there as well, but, it's not Missouri Department of Natural Resources dictating. They're taking public opinion. So that's my only point there.
No, and I understand that, but there's a lot of discretion from what I've been reading and what I've been seeing here today in terms of what you can do with this money. And again, I think when it comes to meetings like this, there's a lot of people out there who are working hard, generating tax dollars, and are too busy to come to meetings like this. So they pay people like me and Steve and others to come here. So I'm here to tell you what I think a large portion of the people out there would actually say and agree with if they heard my words firsthand, that they aren't looking for any sort of special benefit from this money, but they're also saying you need to tread very lightly with it and make sure, because you are absolutely picking winners and losers with this money if you decide on a particular type of vehicle, or you're actually putting in an infrastructure, which is one of the things that I recognize here, charging equipment for light-duty, zero-emission vehicles. It's literally as if I was coming in here asking you for money to put in a new gas station and convenience store. You'd be like, what, are you crazy? So be careful with what I'm saying, and I get that you have your hands tied to a certain extent.
No, and I would just say that, points well taken. I'm glad you're here to actually represent, that part of Missouri, right? I mean, there's a lot of folks, but I mean, just saying that somehow we're picking winners and losers with public money. I mean, the public is the one saying how to spend that money. So I think that's a really important distinction. I mean, if it's public money and the public's saying this is how we spend it, I mean, so be it, right? I mean, it's, I have my interest, you have your interest, and we're all probably going to win. But the real important thing is that, Missouri wins with this $41 million.
I absolutely agree. I'm glad we have the money, and I learned a lot about DERA, whatever it was called. To me, that's a no-brainer. I can't believe you guys don't do that. That just makes sense. You're doubling money that you're investing, so it gives you an opportunity. But I'm not sure the entire public is being represented by these meetings, and I'm not saying that's any problem with DNR or their public notice or anything like that. I just think a lot of people would be worried about spending $41 million about different types of vehicles and fuels that are so in their infancy that I think a lot of people would question the investment in that in order to reduce your overall goal of pollution from mobile sources. I'm just not sure that's the case. I think I don't agree with you on that the public is in agreement necessarily with what's happening so far, although I know decisions haven't been made yet.
Ron,
Yes.
you might have already said this and I just missed it, but did you have an alternative recommendation?
I really don't. I put a couple of things in this document that I had prepared before today's presentation. I mean, I've worked with the state for a long time, and you guys have crappy vehicles in all levels of government. To me, that would be one of the ways that, in my opinion, would be a public good in which you're not necessarily picking infrastructure winners and losers and things like that, to replace a lot of the DNR vehicles, a lot of Department of Ag vehicles, and all the other vehicles with newer, cleaner burning vehicles makes sense to me. Putting in the infrastructure to actually fuel those vehicles is very problematic for me. So, can you do something with parks? No, I'm just kidding. Just kidding on the state parks joke.
I would just say in response
Yes,
to
sir.
the gentleman that it's really not, in DNR's defense, they're not picking the winners and losers. The settlement itself, the categories are set out by judicial decision, and so, the winners and losers are dictated by the judicial decision. So, in terms of the infrastructure, that's one of the categories to be funded, and it actually has a cap of 15%. So these are all dictated by judicial decision.
No, I get that. And I'm an attorney, I understand that. But I also understand there's a ton of discretion with what you're deciding here in this room, and who ultimately makes the decision as to what happens with the money? How does that happen? I mean, I know this is
Not you, apparently.
It should be.
Well,
I get that there's a lot of public input, but somebody ultimately has to make a decision what to do with the money. And so when that happens, I'm hoping that the public good is the primary concern, and that somebody is very mindful of picking winners and losers, or at least that's how I see it.
Ron, I appreciate your comments, and you're right. We've worked together on a lot of different
Sure.
issues, so I appreciate your feedback. I've been asked that question many times, and I think I was even interviewed by a reporter that said, do you seriously think that the advisory committee is going to come to a consensus? And my answer was, it probably is a pie in the sky to think that the advisory committee and everyone participating in the meetings is going to agree on how to spend this money. But we do have some options in distributing it. Maybe we can make everyone happy in some areas. Ultimately, the department is the one that submits that environmental mitigation plan. So we obviously have to write up and defend that. But part of the consent decree requires public participation, and I think we are going a little bit above and beyond that to gather public information. And it is hard, and to contact the general public on issues. And it sounds like we grabbed a few people off the street today that hadn't heard of it before, and I think that's great. And so I encourage you all to share this, and the more feedback we get, the better. But ultimately, yes, we're probably going to have to sit down and hopefully with you all and make some tough calls.
Yeah.
So,
And I wasn't saying that there's any problem with the
Right.
public. You guys do a great
Right.
job. I'm not saying otherwise, but somebody's going to ultimately have to make a
Right.
decision.
Right.
Does this money have to go through the appropriations process? I don't know. It
Well-
seems like it's public money, so it would, but I quite
well,
honestly-
I think we mentioned that at one meeting, but I'm glad you brought that up. We are, for transparency's sake, we are going through the appropriations process.
Makes sense.
So it's just we want to be transparent, just like we are with these meetings. We want everyone to know what this money is doing and where it is going. So yes, it is going through the appropriations process. We're
sense.
starting on the fiscal year 19 budget process right now.
Yeah.
So, and it is in that. We didn't have it in last year's because we didn't know when this was happening. So,
And again, final comments, just please be mindful as you go forward with this, because you are going to be impacting sectors and markets and supply and demand by injecting $41 million into the system. I'm not asking for any of it, but I'm also asking it isn't used against my members, who you all count on to generate all the tax revenue at the local and state level that many of us use and need for our roads and all the other things that GR funds. So appreciate you keep that in mind. Any other questions? Happy to answer any more. Thank you for the time.
sure.
Appreciate it.
Thank you, Ron. All right. Anyone else have comments? I'm sure there's some. Okay, Steve?
I hadn't intended to, but Ron said, tread lightly. I'm going to say tread boldly. I'm going to say kick the door down. There are two findings in there that absolutely suggest to this group, to all of us here, an opportunity. The number one finding is reduce emissions. The number two area is school buses. There are 9,700, don't own these, I think this is U.S. Department of Energy, 9,700 diesel school buses in operation in the state of Missouri. 5,500 of them are pre-2007. School districts have limited funds, and if I'm not mistaken, this last budget go-around, public schools in Missouri had a $39 million cut in their transportation funding. $41 million over 3 years would go a long way toward filling that gap. I represent the propane industry. My name is Steve Ahrens. It's my privilege to represent those guys. And we're not asking for propane buses. We're asking for 50% of the money, at least 50%, a floor of 50% of the $41 million be devoted to replacing diesel buses, pre-2007 buses in Missouri. And that would be available to any alternative fuel, propane, CNG, electric, moonbeams, whatever, can run a bus. I think school districts could use these funds to fill a budget hole that they currently have, that they have no other options to fill. And I think the best part about this is a minimum 25% match from the school districts who are used to doing a 75% match on DERA. I think that makes that very competitive statewide. You can spread this money statewide with a competitive system on public school transportation that will push this money further down the road. And I don't know how the DERA match would work in that instance, but I think we've got an opportunity here. Best case scenario, and I don't know the other bus costs, I know a propane bus cost, at 50% of the money, 25% match, that's 900 school buses. Best case scenario, 100% match. Let's say there's that much demand, 100% match, and because it's competitive, the school districts are putting 50%, 100% of the money available, a 50% local match. You're getting 2/3 of the dirty diesel buses off the road. So this is our opportunity. One of the things to consider, I think, in Mark's presentation was other pollutants. One of the leading causes of students missing school, of course, is illness. Asthma affects small children. Diesel emissions exacerbate asthma. We know the World Health Organization has said diesel emissions are carcinogenic. So getting kids out of that environment, getting the drivers out of that environment, getting the ground service personnel out of that environment are great benefits, have nothing really to do with NOx emissions, but they are part of the emissions profile. So that our suggestion is at least 50% of the money for replacing pre-2007 diesel vehicles. A statewide competition makes it competitive and stretches that money further. And again, even though we represent the propane business, we think all alternative fuels ought to apply for that money and give the schools a lot of choice. I've got a whole bunch of things I could read, but I'm not going to. Any questions? Thank you.
I would say if anyone has any handouts or anything that they want to share with us for the public record, please feel free to give it to any staff here. I see Darcy's cards are out and my cards are out if you need contact information. And then I believe we also gave our information on the presentation. So, all right. Anyone else have a question, comment? Oh, Shelley just put her cards out. And we guilted Mark and Stacy into doing the same thing. So there you go. You can contact any of the Volkswagen team up here. I thought I saw another hand. Is there not anyone else that had questions, comments?
Is this tentative on the future meetings?
Yes, I was just going to ask, we don't have an official date, do we? Are they? Oh, they the date, they tell me, I don't have a copy of the agenda. The dates are on the bottom of the agenda.
Sure. So we went ahead and reserved this conference room all day for the 3 dates at the bottom of the agenda. So there's a date in January, February, and March. They're all Tuesdays. We can ask the group here, do you prefer morning meetings, afternoon meetings? Is there a preference for live streaming? I can't see Van. Do you know how many folks we have participating on the live stream? Are there people on the live stream right now?
Right now, there's 7. There's 15, but there's been as many as 20.
There's been as many as 20 on the live stream. So if folks are in the room, would like us to continue doing live streaming for these meetings, we can set that up as well, but we need to decide what kind of meeting schedule works for everyone, for the majority. If an afternoon, 1 o'clock works, we can do that.
I want to check and see if anyone on the phone has a question or comment too. No? Okay. Did we get any morning, afternoon feedback? We heard an
Folks
afternoon.
traveling afternoon, 1 o'clock works.
Okay.
Okay. We'll go ahead and plan for 1 o'clock then. The next meeting, January 20th, I believe, is what's on the agenda. It's been 16th, sorry about that. January 16th. And you will see the survey number 2 before then? Is that
Yes.
that's still our plan, is you will see survey 2 before then?
Middle of December. Approximately.
And again, we have mentioned that we do intend just to send that to the advisory committee, but if for whatever reason you are not signed up for the advisory committee, and I understand some people are hesitant to do that, but you're still interested in the surveys, please let me know, and I will make sure you get it. We do not want to limit the surveys to anyone who has input, so
Survey 2 will probably take a little bit more time than Survey 1. Survey 1 was probably a 10-minute investment is what we estimated. Survey 2 could be a little bit longer, and that's why we're only sending it to the advisory committee. You guys have kind of made a commitment that you want to provide this input. You're willing to take that time, so just thought I'd throw that out there as another.
They tell me it's more technical, so that probably means if you have any questions on the survey, you need to talk to Mark, Stacy, or Shelley. Any more questions, comments, feedback? Well, as we've done with all of our meetings, the staff will hang around for a little bit because I do know some people have questions and just don't want to be videotaped, and I understand that. So please feel free to ask any of us questions and check out our website, and thank you for your participation. We'll see you in January.